Okay, so welcome everybody to the November 2021 Virtual Quality Talk. As always, we thank D2L for letting us use their corporate Zoom account. And as always, we remind you that if you want to keep in touch, we typically post all of our updates and interesting information on Twitter, so you can follow us there. We are at KWSQA. I guess for the last time, here is a summary of your 2021 KWSQA board. More on that coming shortly, but these are the fine folks who work hard to bring these events to you each month and keep the organization running. So we normally don't do a virtual quality talk in December. We just figure with it normally falling on the last Wednesday of the month, that's not a great time for most people who tend to be taking holidays in December. So this is the last quality talk of 2021, but we do hope to see you again in January. We do have our January talk already confirmed. We've got Lavina returning to present for us again. This time with a topic about accessibility and how that fits into testing. If you have an idea for a quality talk that you might like to share in 2022, we would love to hear from you. There is a form you can fill out to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your talk, which you can find on our website. Similarly, if you belong to a company that would be interested in partnering with us on one of our testing games events, we are prepared to host these virtually if you're interested. So again, if you visit our website, there's a form you can fill out to let us know a little bit more about you, and we'd love to hear from you and potentially work with you on one of these events. So today is the day that voting opens for the KWSQA board election. So if you are a voting member this year, you will receive your voting instructions today about where to go and how to do it and details on the nominees. And voting will be open starting today and running until Friday is the 26th. And so we will announce the results of the board election on December 1st at our annual general meeting. Which I guess I probably should have included a slide about, but if you are a member, you would have received the information about how to join the AGM. It takes place a week from today, next Wednesday evening. Just kind of a short recap of how 2021 went for the organization and what we're looking ahead to do in 2022. So again, if you are a member, you would have received an invite for this event already. Otherwise, just a reminder about our code of conduct, which applies to all of our KWSQA events, including these virtual quality talks. Always happy to hear from you if you have any questions about the code of conduct. Just reach out at the email address on your screen there. So for today, pretty standard outline. We've got a presentation that we will start with very shortly, followed by audience Q&A. Our presenter has told me that there should be plenty of time for Q&A, so maybe make note of things you'd like to follow up on or discuss further as we're going through the presentation. And this is your last opportunity if you complete the feedback survey about this talk that you'll receive after it's over. It's your last opportunity to be entered in that draw for the Amazon gift card. We will be doing the draw and announcing the winner at our AGM. However, if you win and you're not at the AGM, that's okay. You'll still get your prize, but that's just sort of the initial place that we'll announce it. We'll connect with you afterwards to get you your prize. So today we have a presenter that you might be pretty familiar with if you've come to KWSQA events in the last little while. Bailey, one of our board members, is going to be doing a talk today. So excited to welcome her here for that, although I guess she probably would have come to this meeting anyways, even if not presenting. But I had the opportunity to work really closely with Bailey over the last year or so, and I know she's got lots lots of great knowledge and perspective to share on this topic and on everything related to testing, really. So I am looking forward to hearing this, and I will turn things over to her now.
All right, can everybody see my screen properly?
Awesome. Good.
Apparently becoming the spotlight presenter causes some weirdness with Zoom. Okay, so like Tina said, I'm going to be talking today about how one size does not fit all. Originally, this was just for testing processes. We're still going to focus on testing processes today. But this is definitely applicable to basically all of the processes that you might have on your engineering teams and especially your development teams. So first of all, who am I and why am I qualified to talk to you about any of this? So right now I'm working as a test strategist for AVIC, which is originally based out of Waterloo, where we're focused on network management. I'm also a board member for the KWSQA. I've been in, testing related roles for over 6 years now, at a variety of companies and in a variety of roles. And my Twitter handle is down there below if you feel like following me or tweeting about this at all. So what are we actually going to talk about today? So first of all, we're going to define what I'm actually talking about when I say, individual testing processes. So what do those look like and what can that mean? Once we have figured out what it means, we'll talk about the benefits and the risks to having individualized team processes within your team and your organization. From there, we'll help determine if an individual team process is a good fit for your organization. And then if it is, how are we going to evolve into having those processes from generally, most teams are kind of at the overarching organization-wide process if you're, thinking about moving away from that. And then to close it off, we're going to talk about the biggest issue that teams face when they have individual team processes, which is how do they actually maintain cohesion with the other teams when everybody's kind of doing their own thing? So first of all, what are individual team processes? Individual processes are created, utilized, and maintained by teams instead of a process prescribed at an organizational level. To kind of make that a little more clear, individual processes are processes that are based on the context of a team. So they're very specific to that team and what they're working on and who is on the team. Some examples of individual processes that I've seen on teams. So some teams are doing this and some teams aren't. There's obviously a lot of examples here. Some of the, ones that people tend to get a little alarmed by are having no testing, not doing code reviews, not doing retros, having a product manager be part of the team, not having them be part of the team, having an extensive testing suite, not having those extensive testing suites. All of these are different things that I've seen teams do. And some of these have been done really, really well, depending on what a team is working on. Even if they're things that you might look at and think, I don't know how a team could possibly function in that world. So what are the benefits and the risks to having individual processes? Some of the benefits that teams tend to find instead of having kind of that monolithic, overarching process is an increased efficiency on the team because you're actually doing processes that make sense for the work that you're doing. It adds a sense of ownership to the team. So because the team is deciding their processes and they're really responsible for them, they feel like, they own them and they're a little bit more involved in those processes. It adds trust from the team back to the organization because they're able to actually define their own processes and their own work. It's able to fit the context of the team's focus and the project that they're working on. So experimental teams, for example, probably have a different set of processes than somebody who's working on an authentication framework where things are a little bit more, cut and dry. You need things to work a certain way. It also utilizes the team members' individual skills and experience. So it's not just the context of the project that you're working on, but it's also the context of the team members that are on that project right now. So you're able to use that experience. And it allows for greater experimentation. So you're able to actually try new things out a little bit easier. You can see how things are working and you can pivot a little bit more quickly when things aren't working well for your team. Of course, there's also risks to doing individualized processes. I want to start this by saying these aren't things that are guaranteed to happen if you go to an individualized process, but they're things that you need to be aware of if you're already in this space or if you want to move towards it. So you can have a lower or a complete lack of transparency for the company. So if your teams are doing their own thing, but they're not documenting that and they're not telling other people about it, you lose that transparency into what's actually going on. You can have a potential lack of tracking for your processes, which leads to that lack of transparency. So if you're not writing things down, even your team members can get confused. You have confusion on the team around what processes are actually going on. And did we change away from that? Are we still doing that? It increases the learning curve when you're moving between teams. If each team is doing their own thing and you're not sharing that knowledge of what's actually going on and what's being done, starting on a new team is basically like starting in a new company, which can add a lot of overhead to that onboarding process. There's a risk of lost or missing data during audits. So if you actually need to have certain data tracked over time and your team changes their process to not have that anymore without realizing the value of it, it can come back and bite the team later on. And then the biggest thing, which I've said we're going to talk about at the end, is a lack of cohesion among teams. So when everybody's on their own process and they're doing their own thing, it can be hard to make the teams feel like they're all still connected to one another and they're not just silos within the organization. So now that we've kind of talked about some of the benefits to doing this, some of the risks to doing this, how are you going to actually determine if individual processes are a good fit for your team and your organization? So starting off with the indicators of a potentially bad fit. If you have strict contractual obligations and you have processes that are born out of that and they need to be adhered to, so this is especially relevant if you have large government contracts, if you're in the security industry, if you have really strict ISO requirements, that could mean that this isn't going to be the greatest fit because you need to make sure that those things are still being done. If you're in a state right now where you have very poor communication among your teams and your organization, like we said, some teams go into this individual process and they kind of silo themselves off, which if you already have bad communication, this is probably going to make that problem substantially worse. If you have strict waterfall workflows in place right now, so if you have that process going on, adding in everybody doing their own thing doesn't really work in that kind of model. And if you have a tightly coupled architecture amongst different areas of the product. So if team A is absolutely reliant on team B, then they need to kind of know what team B is doing and make sure that the quality of what they're producing is going to match up to what they need over on their side. So what are some indicators of a potentially good fit for your team? So if all of your teams are working on individual pieces of the product, so everybody kind of has their area of expertise, their area that they're working on, this is a great opportunity for your team to actually take that ownership and start to define processes that work for them. If you have or you're working towards decoupled architecture, again, if you're able to kind of be in that space where everybody's working on their own piece of the product, you probably are, you have this decoupled architecture or you are working towards it at this point. And then if teams are finding that they have a lot of overhead and gaps in their processes, this is probably the biggest one. If you're finding that your team is doing a bunch of things that don't make any sense for the code that you are actually working on, changing that up and having your own processes is probably a great step to making the team a lot happier, but also really increasing the efficiency of your team. And another indicator is that some teams are probably already doing this covertly. So they're still doing that big process, but they're also kind of doing their own thing on the side that they need to do. So if you've decided that this is a good fit, how do you actually move away from having a monolithic process to having these individual processes and determining what those should look like for your team? So I've broken it down into kind of 4 stages that you might be in. So there's the old school standardized process. Everybody's doing the exact same thing on the teams. The next one is having that standard process, but with a little bit of specialization. So the teams are doing a little bit on top of that makes sense for the context of what they're working on. And then they have static individual processes. So each team has their own defined process. They're able to, have that set in stone, but they're not changing it very often. And then the last one is having dynamic individual processes. They're constantly evolving as the team does and as the product that they're working on evolves. So how can you move from a standardized process down into a standardized process with the specializations? First thing, review your existing process. And this isn't just like in the teams to review it. If you have an org-wide process, it needs to be kind of reviewed at an org level. So this could be, certain representatives from all of the teams get together, they go through, they figure out, what the process is, if it's even still the process that you have documented, if it needs to be updated. And then once you have that, as that group at the org level, you can review it for potential unnecessary steps. So if you have this one that's been around for say 5-10 years, maybe there's steps in it that already aren't valid for anybody in the organization, and you can start to take those out. Once you have defined this process that is at your team level or your organization level, you want to review that process within your team. So get everybody on the same page about what the current process is. And then once you've done that, review it for the gaps that are specific to your team. So is there things that it's not covering that you also need to cover? So kind of going back to the authentication example, maybe there's like this standard process, but you also need to be checking for like vulnerabilities on a security side that aren't very relevant to other teams. And you're able to actually put those in as your specializations. So now you've got your standardized process, you've got the specializations of what your team also needs to do to fill the gaps in that old process doesn't have for you. And you need to document it. So write it down, figure out what it looks like, get everybody on the same page, and you've moved yourself over to having a standardized process with specializations. Theoretically, one team could be doing this as an experiment, or all of the teams could be doing this at the same time. But either way, when you're moving into this, you want to kind of stay in the next state for a little while, let the teams get comfortable with it, make sure that that's actually working for your team, make sure you're reviewing those specializations, and then you could move over into having static individual processes from there. So when you decide that you want to move away from that one org standard process, and the teams want to kind of have more autonomy and be able to define their own processes more, you once again have to review that existing one. So review what the old document was with the specializations, because just because you're moving away from having the standardized process doesn't mean you want to throw out everything that old process had. There's probably still pieces of it that are relevant to you. So you want to make sure that you're keeping those. And even having like individual processes on teams doesn't mean every team is doing some completely unique process. There's probably still going to be a significant amount of overlap in your teams. So once you've kind of reviewed the existing documentation, the biggest thing here is reviewing it for overhead. So before we were trying to fill in the extra gaps that we had, so we were tacking on some extra process onto the original monolithic one. In this case, we're going to start to take out the pieces that just don't make any sense for our team. So for example, you're on an experimental team again, maybe you don't need to have the same like strict processes that the other teams have, because you actually aren't customer facing at this point. And you're able to change that process to take some of that overhead out and increase the efficiency of your team. And then later on, as your team evolves, you'll be able to look at adding some of that back in as necessary. Any potential changes that you want to do, discuss them with the team and kind of document why they make sense for the context of your team. So, hey, we want to use Cypress instead of Selenium to do our UI testing. We're doing that because maybe you're on a completely different framework than other teams in the company, and that's completely fine, but make sure that you're kind of documenting the why behind why you're changing your processes as well. And then once you've documented them, share them publicly. Like I said before, there's probably going to be overlap between teams still, and what's relevant to your team could actually still be relevant to another team. So being able to share that documentation, and then you can learn from other teams can learn from you. You can kind of learn from each other's process changes and maybe make some of your own to increase your efficiency. Once you've got these static individual processes that theoretically aren't changing all that often, your next state would be to move over into having dynamic individual processes. So these ones are going to change significantly more frequently, and they're going to evolve as the team does. So I mentioned earlier that having processes based on context doesn't just mean the context of your product or the piece of code that you're working on. It also depends on the team. So you could have new members joining your team that are experts in some new tool, and you want to be able to change your team processes to experiment with that and see how that's going, and do that on, a more regular cadence than, say, before maybe you were only looking at things every year or every 18 months. So in order to do this, you need to set up that regular cadence for reviewing your existing process. So you can do this every quarter. You can say you're doing it every year if that's what makes sense to your team. You can review it every time there's a new hire, whatever makes sense for your team, but make sure that there is a defined cadence for how often you're going to be reviewing these processes. Experiment with new processes and document your results. So if you want to try switching, your testing framework, or you want to say, hey, we're going to try no more manual testing for the next 2 months and see how our quality goes. Do those experiments and make sure that you're documenting what happens, because other teams are going to be able to learn from that. So don't just do that experiment, and then if it doesn't go well, just throw it out the door and pretend it didn't happen. It's still a really good learning tool for your team and for other teams in the future. As you make changes, you did an experiment, it worked really well, you're changing your process to reflect that. Make sure you're updating your documentation. Make sure that that is a living document that doesn't just die somewhere, and share those updates and the experimentation results within your organization. We'll go through kind of some ways to do this in a bit, but it's really important to share those and to make sure that you are encouraging questions. Your team is your team, and it can kind of create an echo chamber if you're the only ones that you're running new ideas by. By sharing these externally and really encouraging questions or comments or feedback on your changes, you're exiting out of the echo chamber, and you're letting all of the experts that are in your organization but not on your team also, help teach you things. And there could be some, big risk to this that you haven't thought of or that your team was unaware of, that another team can help you go, hey, maybe that isn't the greatest idea for you guys to do. Or another team has also been wanting to try that out, and they can come back and say, hey, can you let us know how this goes? We might want to do the same thing over on our team. Going along with this, how do you maintain that cohesion across your team? So if everybody's doing their own thing, I've just talked about how important it is to kind of share that information. So we're going to go through some very basic, easy ways that you can maintain that cohesion among your teams without, a ton of work on anybody's part. Biggest one, I think you're probably sick of hearing me say, to document the changes that you're making, but it's the most important step. Even if you do nothing else, if you have a documentation around your process that is publicly available, somebody else in the organization could at least go find that. They could go to your team page or something like that and be able to see and say, oh, okay, cool. So this team, has no manual testers right now. Oh, but they have this extensive test suite and this extensive test suite. Oh, and they do a smoke test before they go to production, and they do this other kind of testing. That's really cool. I wonder if that would work on our team. Or they can come look at it and go, what do you mean you don't have a manual tester? What is going on here? Somebody explain. And you can go and start that conversation with them. These documents have to be living documents. They need to be updated on a regular basis. If your documents aren't being updated, they're probably already out of date. You're not going to be in a great spot to, be able to share that knowledge because you're not updating it. Again, you want to make sure you're updating them, especially in that dynamic process. Otherwise, you still need to set some kind of cadence, even if it's, every year. We're going to look over our documentation again. This goes for everything. This isn't just like your testing processes. Please review the documents that you have. Make these the source of truth. So if you have a new hire onboarded and you go to your process document and you're like, oh, just kidding, we don't actually do it that way anymore, update it. Make sure that that's your source of truth, not just, oh, this random person over on the team knows the process that we go through. They'll tell you all about it. Make sure that that's being updated so that, especially onboarding, somebody has a spot to go and they're able to see what's going on. And lastly, make sure they're publicly available. So if only your team has access, that's not really helping anybody that's outside of your team. Next, meet with communities of practice. These can be called a million different things: communities of practice, guilds, meetups, whatever you want to call them, you need to have some kind of open forum for sharing knowledge and ideas. Most of the time, I see these kind of oriented around a role. So there'll be like a developer guild and a testing guild. And it's great to have them like oriented that way, but make sure they're not limited to that. So say there is like a testing community of practice. That's a great spot to talk about, things relating to quality and testing within your organization. Different teams can share the updates to the processes that they're doing, but make sure that it's not only testers who are allowed to join that meeting, especially if you have, for example, a team without a tester. The developers on that team might also want to come ask some questions, learn some things. Same with the developer one. No reason that the testers can't be going and joining and learning from the developers that are within the organization as well. And the biggest thing about these communities of practice is making sure that you are discussing the wins and the losses. Like I said, if you run an experiment and it doesn't go well, don't just throw that out the window. It's still really important to make sure that you are sharing that information. You're, giving other teams the opportunity to say, oh, so that didn't work for you because of this main reason, but that doesn't apply to us. So they might still want to go and try that out again. And if you're not sharing that information with them, that whole process could just get thrown out the window at an org level when it could have actually been applicable to another team. And the last one, this is probably like the hardest one for teams to implement, is allowing time and space for shadowing each other. So if you're actually, it's great to read about it. It's great to hear about it in a community of practice meeting, but it's even better when you're able to pair with somebody and see what the processes and ceremonies are looking like on their team. If you're actually able to join in and see, oh, your team doesn't do stand-ups. Can I join your stand, or you don't do them in person, you do them on Slack. Can I join the channel? Can I see how that looks? Can I see how efficient that is? Oh, you only do 30-minute retros versus an hour. Can I join and see what that looks like? Making sure that you're inviting them to not only view your processes and ceremonies, but you're also inviting them to share their experiences with your team. So as part of this, they're able to kind of give some feedback at a team level, and they can say, oh, hey, I noticed this. Is that working for you guys? Is that not working? That sort of stuff is really helpful. And making sure that you actually have space to do one-on-one pairing as well. So, especially, hey, we run smoke tests. Cool. Could I sit with you and see how that looks? We write Cypress tests. Awesome. Can I sit with you, see how that looks? It's just a good way for people to actually be able to feel more engaged and to learn a lot more easily, especially depending on, how people learn within your teams. So those are 3 just kind of high level ways that you can try to maintain that cohesion among your teams. There are tons of other ways out there. These are just the 3 main ones that I've used on my teams to make sure that we're all staying, connected, and we're actually aware of what's going on outside of our little silo. So to wrap this all up, individualized processes can reduce overhead, fill in gaps, and increase the efficiency of teams, but they require work. This is basically me saying that this is not a silver bullet. Kind of like everything in the tech and development world, there is no easy way to make everything better. They require work, but it is a great way to increase that efficiency in your teams, from my experiences. So what are the next steps if you are working towards having individualized processes, or you think that this might be something that makes sense, or even if you're already in this and you're kind of struggling with it? First of all, determine what your processes are. Even if that's at an org level, if you are somewhere towards having mostly individual processes, just determine where you're at and what your current processes are. Then determine if having more individualized processes are a good fit for your team. Look at the things that we talked about earlier. Look at the contractual obligations that you have. Look at the things that you have to do. But still keep in mind, are there ways that we can work around this? Can we get somewhere in the middle? Can we get to that standardized process with some specializations? And then iteratively work towards them. Don't try to jump all the way from having a standardized process to having dynamic individual processes in a single day, please. That would be a huge shock to your teams, and there's probably going to be a ton of information and requirements that get lost along the way. So working towards it slowly and over time and making sure that everybody's comfortable at each stage. Next, working to maintain that cohesion among the teams in your organization. Use the tips that I've mentioned today. Start to find ways, that you're maintaining that cohesion on your own. If there's other things that you're doing, kind of leads into the last one of share those experiences. Share them with groups like KWSQA, share them, amongst your organization, share them in your network, because all of that is going to help to just increase the efficiency on your own organization, in your network, your friends, different companies, all of that. Sharing those experiences helps other people learn. And that's a lot of what having individualized processes does, is it lets people learn from one another without having to make all of the mistakes themselves. So thank you for listening to me. Again, there's my Twitter handle. There's my website. Not that I post on it a whole lot these days, but still, if anybody has any questions, I'm just going to read the chat quickly. So yeah, for the being able to kind of review, other teams to be able to review those process changes or those experiments that you have made. And I think for me, historically, we use those communities of practice to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to go through those. So you could actually have the opportunity to each team has the opportunity to kind of stand up and say, hey, we did this, we'd like to talk about it, and share that information out. Also having Slack channels or whatever internal messaging you use, posting it there and just kind of saying hey, if anyone has a chance to review this, I'd love to chat about it. That one kind of gives people an opportunity to do it more on their own time. And you're asking for questions in that kind of space as well, and just saying, post them in the thread or send the message to me directly. That one is just a little bit easier for time sensitivity. If not everybody can make your community of practice, depending on how large your organization is, especially. And even if you talk about it in a community of practice, posting it in a Slack channel, if you have one for that group, is great in case people missed it.
This isn't so much a question, but maybe just a discussion topic. You kind of showed a progression, a scale from everybody's got the same standard process on one end, and then everybody's got individual and dynamic process on the other end. Something that I've observed at places that I've worked is that it's maybe not always just a linear progression. A pattern I've seen is, starting out with highly standardized and rigid processes, and then over time there's some flexibility introduced and the teams kind of diverge a bit, and then eventually it kind of hits this point where it's oh my goodness, everyone is doing such different things and everybody has a different tool set, this is just too much for our organization right now. And then it kind of gets reined back in a little bit, and it's a little bit of back and forth. I don't know if there's I guess maybe what I'm observing is that there's sort of an organizational level fit as well too, which can change over time. Sometimes the organization needs it to be a little more standard and other times less so, and going back and forth. So yeah, just wondering if you have any thoughts about seeing that kind of pattern as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've also seen teams where, for example, the security team has to always stay on a standardized process because of some of those things I mentioned in the bad fit. If you have audit tracks that you absolutely need to have, then you need to kind of stay more in that world. But it does mean that some other teams in your organization could move to having more flexible style. It's why I kind of use Oregon team throughout, because there's times where this will go at an org-wide level, and there's times where there's one specific team who actually is kind of in a different position than the rest of the company. Biggest thing, they're an experimental project. It's just a proof of concept. We're not really sure where it's going yet. They don't need to kind of have the same super high standards yet because it's not customer facing. So that could be like the only team that gets to do it. In terms of the moving back up the scale of kind of moving away from everybody getting to do their own thing, a lot of the times I find that that happens when you don't have that cohesion among your team. So everybody ends up completely siloed and they're not sharing that information with other people. And because they're not sharing it, everybody ends up on a different framework and everybody ends up with kind of their own way of doing things. But so in that case, like moving back up makes sense, but if you're going to move back down again, so you're going to try to have those more dynamic processes, it's very important to understand why it didn't work before. I'm going to guess that at least 8 times out of 10, it's because there was no cohesion among the teams anymore and people weren't talking about what was going on between their teams. So being able to kind of bring that back and make sure that the next time where we want to kind of move towards those individual processes again, that's our biggest focus is. So if we're moving away from this, how do we keep that cohesion this time so that we're able to actually stay aligned on things and make sure that we don't end up kind of back in the Wild West where everybody's doing completely different things, because there probably should be overlap between your teams. There are going to be similarities between what teams are doing that it completely makes sense to have them doing at least similar processes amongst them.
Yeah, so individualized process doesn't necessarily have to mean a completely different thing per team. It's just like there's, each team maybe picks and chooses from some common elements and stuff like that.
It definitely does not mean you should have a completely unique process. Individualized processes definitely does not mean having unique ones. You should be able to see where the overlap is with other teams and see where that could also have overlap in your processes. And it's great if another team is already doing it and your team wants to adopt it, because now you have a bunch of subject matter experts that are there to help you get that started. So, again, we want to use a new framework. Cool. This team's already good at it. They can bring that in.
Cool. Looks like there's another question in the chat for you, kind of around like if there's a centralized team that helps to manage processes and how you've seen that work.
The companies I've been in, we don't have teams that are focused on that. Lot of startups that kind of, started out very small, which also led to everybody was doing the same thing. And then as you expand, how does that need to change over time? Definitely like interesting concept to have like a team that's actually in control of that, because they feel like that would really help, especially with the cohesion among teams. You have one central spot to go to for that. Sorry, just reading the next question. I'm not sure as a whole. There's a lot of software companies throughout the KW area at this point. The biggest place where I've seen this and I've experienced this, kind of like I alluded to before, was startups that have really grown. So when they were a small team, say, the development team was only 10 people, they had one process. And then as all the teams expanded out from there, that process remained the same. But now that they're shifting what their priorities are, and especially as I've seen, teams moving away, having that decoupled architecture where each piece needs to be able to function independently of the rest of the product, they want to be able to do their own thing that's specific. So if you have a standardized process, for example, that says you have to do certain UI tests, but you have a back-end only team, that process no longer makes sense to that team. And how can you still make sure that they're doing, other things that need to get done, but you're not putting that inefficiency on the team. So especially if you have, say, like a testing template where here's the things that we need to check, that UI one's always going to be a headache. It's always going to be the team going, this isn't applicable to us. And if your CI pipeline's like, no, you need it though, that's where you start to run into these issues and you'll want to start to move away from that standardized process. I've also seen some bigger organizations that are starting to move to that like decentralized model where they want to make sure that their teams are being like have that autonomy to function independently. They're almost at like a bigger scale trying to move away from this. So especially if they, for example, had waterfall, they're starting to move to agile, the teams want that autonomy. They're starting to try to find ways to do that efficiently and safely for their teams. If that makes sense. If not, put it in the chat again, or feel free to unmute. All right, so processes where you have legacy and a newer version of this. There is going to be differences between your legacy and your automation version. I'm kind of curious here. You said some members. Do you mean like members of the team are doing different processes for this, or different teams are doing different processes of this? But either way, the biggest thing here, processes definitely look different for, okay, same team. Processes look different for legacy software versus newer versions of the software, and that's understandable to a degree. But you need to make sure that they're consistent within their realms, if that makes sense. So legacy logging should look the same as legacy. The new stuff can look the same as the new stuff, but as a team, you need to kind of discuss and get on the same page about what that process should look like for each one, and make sure that whatever is different between them is different because it doesn't make sense anymore. For example, so, hey, in the legacy one, we did this specific action but in the new one, that action no longer exists, or it's no longer needed because of this. So getting that alignment among your team on what those processes should look like is going to be really important. You need to have that alignment, especially within your own team, on what your processes look like. Having different members of the team do it in different ways is, you kind of don't have cohesion among your own team anymore, and you need to bring everybody back together, document what that process should be looking like, and make sure you're all on the same page for it. Having offshore testing teams, they could absolutely still benefit from it, especially if, I don't know if you have like an entire test team that just like rotates between the different teams in your development organization or that kind of thing. But, they might have a different set of processes depending on the area of the product that they're actually working on at that point in time. And that does make sense, as long as kind of the individualization that comes from that one, you'd want to make sure they're still discussing it with the team, like the development team as a whole, to make sure that you're aligned on making sure that those testing processes do make sense for the code that's being developed. One sec to read through TJ's.
I don't think there's actually a question in there. He's just kind of building on some of the stuff that we've been talking about, and says that it's great to see you and he liked your talk. I can see right now that he's got his headphones off. So
fair enough. Awesome. I'm glad that helped. But yes, teams definitely do move backwards. If you're moving backwards, just try to have that conversation on why you're moving backwards. Again, I have a feeling we know where it's going to end up being, but then you can use that as a framework for moving forward. How can you make that a little bit more efficient? So anybody else have questions?
Hi, Bailey. I'd like to ask a question.
Yep.
Yeah, I figured I'd just ask instead of use the chat. I'm just wondering, like, in your experience, do you feel with this pandemic going on and people working from home, the processes, are they any different how they're implemented virtually as opposed to being in person? Do you feel like there's a difference there?
Implemented, definitely. I've seen teams keep the same basic process, but for example, you can't just walk over to someone's desk anymore and ask them like certain questions. So baking that into your processes is actually really handy, we've found. So having things as part of your process, they're like, if you find an issue, here's the Slack channel to go post your messages to, or, you know, we even have, for example, processes that changed. A lot of people don't have in-person stand-ups anymore. A lot of teams are moving to like these Slack stand-ups. But how do you make sure that you're still getting the same like value and information out of it? So I've seen teams put into like bake right into their process. If somebody, you know, has a question, we jump on a Zoom call instead of try to sort it out in Slack. They bake that into the process of, if this is more than a, you know, 3 reply thread or something like that, then that's their trigger for what probably would have happened more naturally before the pandemic, of somebody looks frustrated at their desk and you go and ask them what's going on. You can't do that anymore. So yeah, I've seen teams, and I know my teams are actually putting it right into their processes for kind of those differences now of when do we trigger those virtual conversations, or how do we trigger those virtual conversations that can't happen organically anymore.
Right.
Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Cool.
Anyone have final thoughts or questions? Good discussion, though. I think this was a good audience participation. Good job, audience, and also good job, Bailey. Thank you for sharing all of those insights with us. Yeah, I guess we'll get a few minutes back for people to finish up lunch and whatnot before they get back to work today. But appreciate seeing you all here, and looking forward to seeing you again in 2022, which sounds like some futuristic date in my head right now, but realistically, it's only a month away. So enjoy your December, and hope to see you again soon. See you next time.